The cornerstone event for compounding pharmacists, Compounding Pharmacy Compliance East, returns this November with both in-person and virtual opportunities. Don't forget, this is the industry's leading event for compounding professionals and returns in a hybrid format in person November 8th through 10th in College Park, Maryland, as well as virtually November 15th through 17th on a computer near you. Take this opportunity for an in-depth look into key areas for compliance and proven strategies to strengthen compounding systems to ensure inspection readiness. As the regulatory landscape evolves, navigate updated quality standards and evaluate innovative solutions firsthand with top regulators, solutions providers, and the brightest minds in industry. In such uncertain times for compounders, this hybrid conference provides insights into the best practices for processes, protocols, and facility improvements, plus sterility and stability testing and data analysis, all through informative presentations, panel discussions, case studies, and breakout discussions. Plus, earn up to 13.25 ACPE credit hours for pharmacists, the only event serving the unique needs of both 503A and 503B pharmacists. This is a must attend for all compounding professionals. For more information, visit informaconnect.com/compounding-east for full details on the agenda, registration, and special team rates. Or click the links in the show notes at the end of this episode.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. Maintaining product safety and quality during distribution is of utmost importance in the pharmaceutical industry. Just like in other areas of drug manufacture, there's an expected dedication to quality and compliance, which should be present in every aspect of distribution. It is the responsibility of the drug company to comply with distribution requirements, including storage and transport of their products, ensuring its safety and security throughout the supply chain. Today, we will discuss the complexities in supply chain management, the expectations for a GDP audit, and deficiencies in distribution processes with our guest, Siegfried Schmitt. Welcome back, Siegfried. It's so great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Stacey. And it really is nice to be back. Thanks very much.
Absolutely. We've missed you during the pandemic.
Well, I'm not gone, so thank you.
I know. I'm glad. I know you've been extra busy though, because there have been just so many things going on in industry. So super excited to have you here to talk about this topic with us today and share some of your expertise. So to kick us off, Siegfried, can you set the stage for us on this topic? Why single out the GDP process from the entire manufacturing life cycle?
Right, yes. You see, many of our listeners may actually have experience with receiving goods, that they ordered, especially when they ordered them from abroad. And so these issues that our listeners experience are no different to the situation for many in the healthcare industry. So the supply chains, they are highly complex. And with these disruptions that we experience because of the pandemic, really the good distribution practices should definitely receive the attention they deserve. This is why I think we need to talk about GDP now.
Excellent. Thank you. So as you alluded to with the pandemic, supply chain activities have been in the spotlight really this past year, or even more, 15 months at this point. From drug shortages and delays to cold chain distribution, we have been bystanders to the intricacies. What makes the pharmaceutical supply chain so complex?
Well, you see, Stacey, I've been in industry for a long time. And I still remember the days when pharmaceutical companies were vertically integrated. That means really the same company would make the drug substance, the drug product, maybe even distill their own solvents, make their own catalyst. So it was all in-house if you want. But these days are long gone for a number of reasons. And you see that the trade really became global in all respects. And so whereas specialist companies are clustered in certain locations, say Singapore, US, Europe, for example, much of the base industry, the chemical industry, has moved east, mostly India and China. So even a simple, say, 5-step synthesis involves something like 50 to 100 suppliers, because we need to think of that includes items such as filters, chromatography, columns, solvents. And when you think of biological compounds, the whole thing becomes even more complex because they typically require cold storage. And see, vaccines, a typical example, they normally require cold storage, cold transport. And cold transport isn't trivial. So if you need to reach populations in far-flung locations, then transport logistics really becomes very complex.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, we've all seen with a couple of the vaccines for the COVID-19 virus needing extreme cold storage, and maintaining that, depending on where you're shipping to or sending your product to, can be really challenging because a lot of smaller countries or more impoverished countries may not even have the capabilities to maintain those temperatures. So I would think that logistics becomes really challenging at that point. So, and you mentioned obviously that we are using providers and vendors from all over the world. And that leads me to think, not all service providers are equal, right? So how do we manage and prioritize risk across our vendors?
You see, each client-supplier relationship is different. Yeah? And say, if you're a large pharma with huge orders, you're likely to be treated very differently by your supplier than if you're just a small company with a few orders. So the risk profile really depends on your relationship with your suppliers, okay? And therefore, you do need two things, really. You do need a commercial contract, but you also need a quality agreement. And don't take the latter lightly, because you want to know really if the transport of your precious goods, of your precious product, isn't subcontracted to some John Doe who may have a motorbike and has a very cheap rate. So it's important you know what's happening.
Absolutely. And it sounds like, the more you can foster strong relationships with your vendors and suppliers, the better off you are, I guess. The more you have a say in how things are handled, and making sure that those agreements are thorough and that they're abiding by them, right? So that's the other piece of it. I want to talk a little bit about the actual GDP audit process, because I know you've been very involved in that in your current role. So as you prepare to begin a GDP audit, Siegfried, what are the first things you're looking for? And are we starting our day in the warehouse, as many manufacturers might think?
Well, you're quite right, Stacey. This is where they typically take you, the warehouse, to start with, okay? But I really prefer to start at the gatehouse. And that is because this is where actually the goods arrive for the first time. This is where the lorry, the truck arrives, And you need to ask yourself, did I expect this truck? Did I expect that driver? are you checking the number plate of this vehicle? Are you checking the driver's license? Yeah, because after all, you want to have as much perimeter control as you want to have control within your facility.
That's a great point, and one that I really hadn't thought of before. I mean, I think many of us are probably scratching our heads thinking, why do I care what who's delivering the product as long as the product arrives? And why does it matter where, what the truck looks like or whatever? So why, explain that a little bit more. Why is it so important to document the vehicle, the driver, the number plate, as you mentioned? How many crew members might be in the vehicle, when the delivery arrives?
Well, you see, warehouses are typically very busy places. And not in all places do you have staff who may wear company uniforms. So thus a stranger may not be immediately sticking out, and it's obvious there's someone strange in here. And what you really don't want is someone stealing something or tampering with something in your place. But even worse, what if the wrong driver or the wrong truck comes to pick goods up? Not just the delivery, but also the pick up. You see, what are the chances that these aren't just clever thieves? Because we have to bear in mind, pharmaceutical goods are often worth much, much more on the black market than illegal drugs even.
Fair. Yeah, that's fair. And if you're not documenting these things, then the wrong people could be coming in and taking your product away. Understood. So thinking about recording, starting recording as early as, arrival upon the gate, how detailed do we need to be in recording our examination of incoming goods?
Well, I think that there should be a checklist, because it's a bit like when you board a plane, you see the pilots, they're doing their checklists. And although they are doing this hundreds, thousands of times, and it's a routine for them, it is just a good practice. So because you know what you're doing, you're not missing anything. Yeah. But because routine breeds contempt, laziness, and you don't want that. You just want to make sure everything is done repeatedly, correctly. So therefore, having a good checklist is actually quite important. And please, everything you check should also be on the list itself. Because often I ask, do you check, for example, that wooden pallets that you receive are treated? And the answer is typically yes. But very often I find it's not a tick on the list. So
sure, that makes sense. And it sounds like we just need to make sure we're being as diligent with our storage, warehousing and delivery protocols as we are in manufacturing the drugs themselves, right? And I think sometimes we get a little bit complacent about that part of it. We've done our due diligence throughout the the making of the drug, but not necessarily the delivering of the drug sometimes. Thinking about the warehouse and the storage process, what are some of the most common deficiencies or errors that you've noted, on your inspections?
Okay, so you see, in warehouses, you typically have locked areas, say for returned or quarantined goods. Mm-hmm. And these areas, it may be a cage or a separate area with a door, you have locks and keys.
Sure.
And it is amazing how often there is absolutely no control over these keys. There is actually no knowledge who possesses a key. In one instance, there was a bunch of keys in the drawer, and anyone could use them when they needed to or when they felt like. So it's quite surprising, really. Everyone thinks just because there's a lock and key, everything's under control. Okay, so, and I already mentioned the wooden pallets. And it's not just essential that these are treated against infestation, because they can really cause a lot of trouble to your products otherwise. But pallets that are treated bear a stamp. and which also indicates the treatment method. But far too often, warehouse staff have no idea which stamp should be applied to these pallets, so you know that they have been treated in the correct way. And so the third thing I think that is happening far too often as a deviation, it's in a warehouse or in a storage space, you need to have sufficient storage space. And I just get tired of hearing this excuse. Oh, we are already planning for some expansion, okay? When you just can't move it all in the storage location because all the aisles are just full of pallets, or you try to get into the cold storage room and it's piled so high you can hardly open the door. So such places simply have lost control over their storage locations and the storage conditions. And thus you really create an unacceptable risk to the products.
Absolutely. I remember reading one of the stories you had written about people using their warehouse as sort of a catch-all, right? The grill for when the employees want to barbecue some burgers or something is stored in there, and maybe some other, materials from a birthday party they had or a retirement party or whatever, a month or two ago. So I talk a little bit more about that because it's quite humorous.
Well, it was quite funny in a way, because these items were, in fact, in one of these locked areas where only people with the right access rights have access to. And why was it stored there? Because no one comes and snoops about and checks whether things are right or not, because it's all locked away.
Right.
And so, yes, it really can be as you say, a space for storing anything. Or in one case, you could hardly put your drug product into the storage in the warehouse because someone had forgotten to return the empty bottles from the canteen, and they stored hundreds of bottles in there.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
So
definitely not the most efficient use of your space, right?
Not really.
So Siegfried, I want to talk a little bit about virtual versus on-site audits for GDP, because obviously we've been in the position for the last year plus where we are doing a lot more virtually than we have ever in the past. So can you get the full picture from a virtual GDP audit and share with us, an example of things that might get missed during a remote audit here?
Well, with these remote audits, you need eyes on the site somehow, and that is typically video footage.
Right.
But my experience really is that many of the warehouses will not share live footage from their places as part of these virtual audits. So what they do instead is they provide pictures. They provide you wonderful pictures. And I remember when I did the on-site audits, and I hope the times will come again soon, I sometimes find, as I already mentioned, aisles blocked by materials. So not enough storage space. And of course, do you really think the company will share a photo of this disaster zone with you during the audit? Of course they won't, okay? So you can't, I went to performed one audit where I arrived the day before, and I walked around and I saw all the gates were open, all the doors were open, and they were all having some breakfast in the canteen. There was no one about. And you wouldn't see these sort of things if you're not there in person.
Sure. And that's dangerous to just have your facility wide open for anyone to walk in and nobody there to observe you, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So of course, managing our own warehouse is not enough. Even though we are talking, we've been talking about things that you've observed in the warehouse itself, but as a manufacturer, we need to understand the behaviors of our subcontractors and subcontractors too. So can you describe some of the GDP issues inherent in subcontracting? And, what are your recommendations to the manufacturer for minimizing the risk here?
Yeah. I think that the first thing any manufacturer needs to do is to prepare a clear description of the shipping lane. So when it leaves one place and arrives at the other, what is happening in between? Because even if you send it by plane, someone needs to take it to the airport, for example, someone needs to load it, and so on and so forth. So, so these shipping lanes need to be described first of all, but then you also need to make sure you validate them, verify that your material is in fact handled that way that you think it is, and it is also handled under the conditions that you need them to be handled. So, and what is a typical thing in the industry is that the transportation companies are subcontracting. Or if you go to an airport, there isn't just a company like UPS or DHL or whatever who handles your product from your doorstep right to the plane. There will be subcontractors working at the airport who are then handling the on-tarmac handling, or in the warehouse handling, in the bonded area, and so on. So there will be many subcontractors, and you may not always be able to know them.
Right.
So
absolutely.
There is a black hole sometimes, and you will never be able to really get to the very bottom of everything.
Right. And what do you recommend, to manufacturers then, who, obviously they can't put eyes on every single subcontractor, but there still are things that they can do. You mentioned validating the process. Are there other things that you recommend for them?
As I mentioned before, we need to have clearly a quality agreement, at least with the main contractor that you're working with. And of course, with the product itself, one of the things you can do with this is you can put in temp tails to track the temperatures, so you know what temperatures it was exposed to, for example. And also some of the suppliers are, of course, very much aware of the needs of the pharmaceutical industry. And you will find that some have specialist teams and even specialist shipping routes that can provide these extra services that you need for the pharmaceutical industry. So it's appreciated, at least by some of the suppliers, that you need to have some more paperwork perhaps for a vaccine that gets shipped than you need for some building blocks from Lego or so.
Yeah. So it sounds like, you really need to make sure you're selecting those vendors or subcontractors who are not only experienced in pharmaceutical, but have demonstrated their ability to provide the best service here, and because it matters. I mean, it definitely matters. Not always about saving money, right?
In fact, the situation is now such that, as many of us know, when we order things, there are shortages, because there are shortages of supply, really. The demand for transportation is really greater than the supply at the moment. And so that, of course, means it won't be cheap in the first place. But also that not every supplier is thinking of the clients. They may just be thinking of money. So again, I would like to warn the pharmaceutical companies that are hiring, have to use these contractors to make a good choice, a risk-based assessment, a risk-based choice.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. That's a great point. I want to talk a little bit more about the factors around cold storage or cold chain distribution. how do we manage and document all the way to the final destination and beyond?
Okay, we talked a little bit about the shipping lanes. So you need to understand your shipping lanes, and because, as you say, it's precious product.
Mhm.
What you try to avoid is losing product by validating your shipping lanes. You don't want to ship it via a route which turns out this is not an acceptable way to ship it because it gets too hot, it gets too much vibration, whatever it is. But there are many laboratory methods this way. There are even in silico simulations that can be used to validate shipping lanes. It's quite amazing what can be done without actually physically shipping any product. And so companies, especially with very high value products, should really think about using these methodologies before they ship their product through any particular route.
So in addition to validation of the shipping lanes, as a drug manufacturer, do I need to audit transport organizations, all warehouses, all wholesalers, everyone who's going to handle my product? Or does that task sort of fall under the quality agreement you've already set forth with your providers?
Well, first of all, I think audits, we have to be clear, are always a snapshot in time. We will never be able to understand the full picture, first of all, because we will never be there all the time.
Yeah.
And knowing that there will be many subcontractors as well can make it very difficult.
Sure.
So what we need to do is clearly to have a risk-based approach. Who are the key providers of these services? And do they have the appropriate knowledge, quality systems in place, perhaps? Have the technology in place?
Mhm.
See, if you ship, for example, in dry ice, there is a high risk to personnel of suffocation if you don't handle the dry ice correctly. And so we are not just talking about maintaining temperatures, it's also about health and safety, it's about understanding what you're doing. And so audits are a good way of getting a good understanding of your company, but it is always limited. So reputation by the suppliers is a good way to look for the right suppliers.
Excellent. So what are the key requirements for quality systems? Because you just mentioned having good quality systems in place for the vendors. What key requirements would you highlight for a quality system, which is demanded by, I guess, the EU GDP guidelines?
Yeah, so of course the supplier should have a quality system. That is preferred.
Of course.
Now, saying that, see, the complexity of a supply chain, it very much depends on the type of service. For example, a warehouse operator may not even need to have a GDP license if the goods are only stored there for a couple of hours, for a few hours. So it really depends on the actual type of service. Or there are GDP suppliers who organize the route. It's almost like a broker for the shipping, for the transportation. And depending on what they do, again, they don't actually need to have a license, a particular license that relates to GDP for that. So what we're looking for is suppliers who have systems in place that really relate to the GDP regulations. So if I have a warehouse where I have not just a few hours storage, but longer time storage, so where GDP comes into play, then these companies need to have what is called a responsible person. And this responsible person is, in fact, the owner and responsible for the quality system. So that again, through a quality agreement, you are sure that this company you're dealing with does have not just a quality system in place, but also has the staffing in place with the right expertise and competence to comply with the regulations.
Right. And it comes back to what you already mentioned, the reputation of the company and really finding those vendors who are experienced and have already demonstrated their success, right, with this process.
Oh,
yeah.
Yes.
Very important. But it's not always very easy to do that, right? Especially when there are shortages of transportation and other necessary items for business. I can imagine it's quite taxing at times.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is.
So for premises and storage facilities, we're talking a lot about the warehouses and the products that are in them. We also know that there's a certain amount of cleaning that needs to be done periodically here. What does an adequate cleaning program look like in place here? And how can a warehouse achieve this?
Okay, so I mean, in order to be able to clean the facility like the warehouse, really needs to be designed to be cleaned easily. So, for example, the goods should be stored on pallets so they can be moved about and you can clean the floors everywhere. So it also means that you have at the entrance, say, curtains, or you have air showers to prevent ingress of dirt from the outside. So a lot is already about the design to prevent build-up of debris or dirt or anything. So it makes it easy to clean. And well, not most, but many companies may outsource the cleaning, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But what you need to have in place within the warehouse or the facility that needs cleaning is, and that can include vehicles as well, of course, is you need to have a cleaning team that has a clear written instruction how to clean, what cleaning agents to use, and who is doing the cleaning when, how often, so what intervals, who is verifying that the cleaning has been done. I remember one facility where the cleaning was done after working hours, and no one was checking during these hours. And when we did the audit after hours, we found that they were far too lazy to move things about and were just cleaning all around the stuff that was there. So you need the program, but you also need to have a verification that people are doing what they are saying they're doing and what they're paid for, really.
Of course. Of course. So it sounds like, it's funny in this conversation today, we're talking about good distribution practices, but they're really just the same practices that we, should be employing in the entire drug manufacture process, right? We clean our equipment to make sure that we're not getting buildup and that, everything is running smoothly and there's no contaminants, and we're doing the same thing in the warehouse. So if you have good practices, I hope if you have good practices in one area, hopefully you have good practices in the other, right?
I agree with that, Stacey. Yes.
Well, thanks, Siegfried, for sharing some of this information and some stories from your audits. I just want to, before we wrap up today, see if you have any closing thoughts or action items that you'd like to leave with our listeners.
Well, I really think in order to have good control over the distribution network, and this includes not merely the goods that leave your factory, but also the materials that reach you from your suppliers, you just need to know your shipping lanes, as I mentioned before. Mm-hmm. You need to understand the conditions under which your product is transported and stored, and perhaps even more importantly, by who? Who is doing it? And you need to use risk assessments to really identify the risk to your product, quality, but also compliance. And what I hear more and more is now that regulators now demand such information already at the stage where you submit a drug application. So it's no longer just verifying during an inspection, but really FDA and other regulators are asking for your shipping lanes, for your shipping lane validation with your application. So please bear this in mind.
Absolutely. Great last tips. I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Siegfried, for being with us today. It's been great to chat with you.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much, Stacey.
Of course. Thank you again to Siegfried Schmitt for being our guest today. We really appreciate the proficiency and clarification on this topic. Also, I want to give a shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen. And lastly, I'm sending out my appreciation to you, our valued listeners. I'm grateful for your time each week and for your help in sharing this podcast. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, please remember to subscribe in your podcast player of choice and be sure to share with your friends, colleagues, and online networks so they can enjoy it too. Plus, send us a quick note or leave an online review. We'd love to share your feedback with our networks. For show notes and additional podcast resources, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with another innovative and